Welcome back to the Core Enaction series, and in particular to the genealogy season of Core Enaction. I would like to briefly introduce this session number 4, by recalling that in the previous sessions, we accomplished the part of our genealogical path dedicated to the cybernetic origins of Enaction. And we did that through lectures by Professor Bruno Clark and by Professor Juan Carlos Letelier. This evening, we will dedicate this session to inaugurate a new segment of our genealogical path, which focuses on autopoiesis through a lecture by Professor Tom Ziemke. In the introduction and in the previous sessions, we offer very synthetic overviews of the autopoietic cognitive biology, underlying how elaborating the notion of autopoiesis with Umberto Maturana for Francisco Varela represented a very important dimension of his research path. When he obtained his PhD at Harvard, he declined some job offers there to go back to Chile and work to the development of the notion of autopoiesis at the University of Santiago with Umberto Maturana, accomplishing with him research work that he felt was very coherent with the tradition of experimental epistemology founded by Warren McCulloch, on which we focused in the previous sessions. In our synthetic overviews of autopoiesis, we emphasized how this notion is at the center of a theoretical framework that Maturana and Varela elaborated to generate answers for two very deep philosophical, scientific, epistemological questions that are: what is life and what is cognition? And the idea was that of treating these questions jointly, based on the thesis according to which there is a deep continuity between life and cognition, a thesis that Umberto Maturana expressed in that sort of first draft of autopoiesis in the form of the report number 9 of the Biological Computer Lab Directive of von-Foerster, on which we focus through the lecture by Bruno Clark and the lecture by Juan Carlos Letelier. And indeed, in this first draft of autopoiesis, famously, Umberto Maturana said that living systems are cognitive systems, and living as a process is a process of cognition, defining one of the core ideas of autopoiesis. So this evening, through the lecture by Tom Ziemke, we will focus on the notion of autopoiesis and different interpretation of this notion, some related concepts and theories in the genealogy and the affiliations of these notions in the field of the synthetic modeling of life and cognition, philosophy, theoretical biology, and cognitive sciences. Tom Ziemke is a professor of cognitive systems and the Linköping University in Sweden. His research interests are focusing on situated and embodied cognition and social interaction, on which he expresses a very original perspective based also on an extensive and deep knowledge of research paths that are constituting the genealogy and the progeny of the inactive approach, and in particular of autopoiesis. So without further ado, I leave you the stage, Tom. Thank you very much for being here with us this evening. And I stop sharing so you can share your slides. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Okay, let's see if this works now.
Perfect, we are seeing.
Okay, you see it? Because I don't.
Yes, we do see. Yeah, we do see. Although it's with your slides still on the left side.
Wait. Let's see.
Now it's coming.
Now you see the whole screen or the...
We see a presentation mode with some slides below your one.
Okay. I need to swap this place then.
No, this
Perfect.
is good. This is
Now you
good.
see the one slide, yeah?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, well, thanks, Luisa, for the kind introduction. And also thanks for inviting me to talk as part of this seminar series. You probably need to update the picture of me that you were showing, Luisa, because that was from 2009, which is a while ago. I'm not that young anymore. Okay, I'm talking about autopoiesis, obviously. I got a bit worried, I must say, after Luisa's first introduction, so a few weeks ago, because she basically said everything that I was going to say. She said it already in the introductory session. So I was a little bit worried. And of course, I got even more worried when I attended the other two sessions, which also all touched on autopoiesis. So, but by this point, there maybe isn't all that much to say left. But of course, I'll try to say something and try to put it into further context here. So for the people who might be attending this, might be watching this on YouTube, I'm assuming that people have attended or viewed the three previous sessions. So that's Luisa's introductory session, Bruce Clark's session, and Juan Carlos Letelier's session. And yeah, if you happen to be watching this on YouTube and you haven't seen those, you might want to pause now and watch those three first. Okay, let's start. I'll start with Immanuel Kant, which is, died more than 200 years ago, but is still very relevant to many things happening in cognitive science. He's probably also the most misinterpreted philosopher in the cognitive sciences, and notably, you can see that actually both he's claimed as an advocate, both by proponents of traditional cognitive science, who have their focus on concepts, representations, and all that. So if, for example, you read Andrew Brooks' book on Kant and the mind, he very much puts Kant in that perspective and views Kant as a proponent of representationalism, functionalism, and all that, everything that constitutes traditional cognitive science. But Kant is, of course, also, and you've surely heard his name a couple of times in the previous sessions in the seminar, Kant is also, on the other hand, viewed as an early advocate of embodied cognition. In fact, the Norwegian philosopher Helge Svare wrote a whole book about this, Body and Practice in Kant, from 2008. And Kant was probably also the first to view cognition as a biological phenomenon. If you attended the session with Juan Carlos Letelier last week, you probably heard him say that. So Kant is very interesting, but it's also, there are many interpretations of Kant. He's written a lot of stuff. He's written it mostly in German, or all of it in German. So we know of Kant only through translations, interpretations, and so on. So Kant is a little problematic in that sense. Okay, but his relevance in this particular context is that he, in a nutshell, so cutting a rather long story relatively short here, in a nutshell, he distinguished between the world as it appears to us as subjects, and he referred to that as the phenomenal world, or the world of phenomena, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, what he called the things in themselves, or the world in itself, or the noumenal world, of which we cannot have any direct or objective knowledge. And that's an important distinction, which is a little bit at the core of many of the things that I'll say during this seminar. Okay, Kant is, of course, also, we just already mentioned also in the previous session by Juan Carlos, Kant was probably the first to refer to organisms as self-organizing, although, yeah, he was a philosopher, so not a biologist, and yeah, he died more than 200 years ago. So obviously he had a very different understanding of what it means to be self-organizing. But we'll get a little bit more into the details of that. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the original quotes, or translated, of course, but according to Kant, organisms are special and different from other objects in the sense that they are natural, what he calls natural purposes. That means they're goal-directed in the following sense. Here are just a couple of quotes, and again, apologies for the somewhat old-fashioned language. He says, a thing exists as a natural purpose if it is, so in a double sense, both cause and effect of itself. Yeah, we can, of course, recognize some of the circularity that other people have been talking about in earlier sessions. And he also says, in such a product of nature, every part as existing through all other parts is also thought as existing for the sake of the others and that of the whole. That means a tool or an organ bringing forth the other parts, and hence everyone bringing forth one another. And only then, and because of this, such a product as an organized and self-organizing being can be called a natural purpose. Yeah, it's a slightly somewhat philosophical and an old-fashioned way of putting things, but I think those were the only original quotes that I have from Kant here, and we will look at in much more detail at what that actually means. So, but what's interesting here, and what I'll talk quite much about, is that in a paper by Andreas Weber and Francisco Varela, they refer to Kant's position as somewhat of an unstable middle position. Because on the one hand, Kant seems to be saying that that organisms are a particular type of object. They're not regular objects, but they are what he calls natural purposes. That means they have some kind of inherent teleology, purposefulness, and whatever you want to call it. But on the other hand, Kant seemed to be saying that this we couldn't be quite sure. This is at least how many people interpreted it as, that this is a property of those living systems as such, or maybe just a property of our own interpretation of those systems. And this, of course, has to do with what I said a couple of minutes ago about his distinction between the phenomena, the world as it appears to us, and the noumena, that is, the world or things in the world as they are in themselves, without of which we can have no certain knowledge. So the reason that Kant ends up in what Weber and Varela call an unstable middle position is, of course, that on the one hand, he wants to describe living systems as natural purposes, and he seems to think that they really are natural purposes. But on the other hand, he is, of course, committed to the position that we cannot know, we cannot have any certain knowledge about the things in themselves. And that, of course, also means we cannot have any certain knowledge about the nature of organisms. So, yeah, and that's, yeah, as I said, Weber and Varela refer to that as an unstable middle position. And this has been interpreted a little bit like Kant is undecided, and maybe he just means that and everything that refers to a purpose or intrinsic teleology, that maybe that is just our interpretation of organisms. Other people would interpret that differently, but that is a widespread opinion, as it also says here in the quote at the bottom. Weber and Varela say, in our present scientific world, following received and narrow interpretation of Kant, the teleological behavior of living beings is an illusion, an appearance, hiding the underlying mechanism. Okay, and that's needless to say. They say Kant has an unstable middle position, is somewhat undecided, and of course, yeah, they want to help him along and provide a more developed position, which is of course now based 200 years later, or at that point, yeah, actually 200 years later, which is now based on the science and philosophy that have happened in those 200 years. So the question then is, so how do we get from Kant and his somewhat undecided position to what might be called intrinsic or immanent teleology? So teleology, purpose, as part of living systems, not just as part of the description, but as part of how they are. So, and according to Weber and Varela, yeah, they say Kant gives a multifaceted account of the living and anticipates a modern reading of the organism, and even introduces the term self-organization for the first time. But their rereading of Kant in this light is strengthened by a group of philosophers of biology, and they mention Hans Jonas as the central figure, and I'll talk a bit more about him later. So a group of philosophers who put back on center stage an organism-centered view of the living, an autonomous center of concern capable of providing an interior perspective. And yeah, so sorry for the long quote, by the way. There are many long quotes in this presentation, but that's just a technicality. Okay, so, and they say, so that's what is present at the core, or what is, of which Kant has a undeveloped notion. It finds a convergent development from this current of philosophy of biology and the scientific ideas around autopoiesis, two independent but parallel developments culminating in the 1970s. Yeah, I'll get back to that with an illustration in a second. And that long quote finishes saying, instead of viewing meaning or value as artifacts or illusions, both agree, and by both they here mean the scientific work in the autopoiesis school and the philosophy of biology as represented by Hans Jonas. They both agree on a new understanding of a form of immanent teleology as truly biological feature, inevitably intertwined with the self-establishment of an identity, which is the living process. And yeah, we of course, I think everybody understands that we're moving towards autopoiesis here. So I have, let's have a look at that diagram that I promised, and which is actually relatively central in this presentation. So what they're saying is, yeah, in the beginning there was Kant. Kant had certain views on intrinsic teleology, and he seemed to view organisms as intrinsically teleological, purposeful. But he seemed somewhat undecided, which my interpretation is that has to do with this distinction between noumena and phenomena. And what they want to do is they want to talk about these two parallel strands of developments between the, yeah, let's say the 50s to the 70s approximately. And by that, on the one hand, they mean the autopoiesis school, which you could say is the scientific route. And on the other hand, the work of Hans Jonas and related philosophers, which you could say is the philosophical route. And so that's the view or the ambition that they present in that paper by Weber and Varela from 2002. What I'm going to add here is what's in the middle here. That is Jakob von-Uexkull's theoretical biology. Because it fits in historically, because it came before these other two routes, and it follows directly from Kant. So it's a building block that constitutes a bridge to some degree there. And it fits in because, well, in this particular diagram, you have the philosophy on the one side and the science on the other side, and von-Uexkull also fits in almost perfectly in the middle there, because he was on the one hand a scientist. His training was in muscle physiology, but he worked also, and maybe he's most famous for his work in theoretical biology, which is leaning more towards the philosophical side. Okay, and I'll be going through these developments. So what here looks like the blue root, the green root, and the red root or pink or whatever color that is. I'll be going through those in historical order, you could say. So I'll talk about von-uexkull first, then briefly about Hans Jonas, and then finally about autopoiesis, which is of course in some sense the main point of this particular session. Okay, so let me also point out just briefly here that this session is a little bit different from the other three, because the other three were very much about the genealogy, very much in terms of who met who, when, and who traveled where, when, and the personal friendships and allegiances and so on. Whereas this particular, my contribution here is more to the genealogy in terms of, related concepts, related ideas. But it's a little, as this diagram illustrates here, it's not necessarily that people actually met or used each other's theories so very much, but because they were separated, well, geographically, they were separated in time, and they were also separated by language. So it's much less than the previous three sessions about the personal contact. It's more about how the ideas and then concepts relate to each other. Okay, let's get started with Jakob von-Uexkull then. So Jakob von-Uexkull was a physiologist, as I said. He was focused initially on muscle physiology, but he also worked as a theoretical biologist. And he, in particular, and that's the relevance why I bring him up here in the discussion following from Kant, because he explicitly stated that it is the task of biology to expand the results of Kant's research, which is, of course, maybe a little unusual for biologists, at least at that time, to say explicitly that he wants to expand Kant's philosophical research. Okay, one thing that von-Uexkull is famous for is that he stated that all reality is subjective experience, which is one of his main points, which of course follows directly from Kant, what I said about phenomena and noumena, and us not being able to know very much directly about the noumena. So it's all about the phenomena, the subjective experience, which to us appears as reality, but of course is according to Kant and von-Uexkull is fundamentally different from the noumena. Okay, and von-Uexkull is Juan Carlos talked a little bit about this last time. It's maybe most famous for his Umwelt concept. That is I'll explain it in a little bit more detail on the next slide, but in a nutshell, it's the idea that each and every animal or animal species perceives the world differently based on their own needs. I mean, the diagram in the middle there is a rough illustration of how a person, a dog, and a fly might be perceiving the same room, and how they might find what von-Uexkull refers to as different functional tones, or what Gibson would call affordance, how they might perceive the world very differently based on their own needs, on their own perceptual apparatuses, and on their own the way they interact with the world. If, for example, you're a fly, obviously you could land on the lamp there, which is not an affordance that would appear for a person or a dog. Whereas the book that's shown there on the left is something that might be an affordance to a person, but would be completely irrelevant to a fly or a dog. So yeah, let's go on. Okay. Here's another long quote. So von-Uexkull, as I said, he was born in 1864. So he was active in the beginning of the 20th century. and he was very much opposed to the mechanicism and behaviorism at the time. He, as it says here in the quote, he argued that the mechanists have pieced together the sensory and the motor organs of animals, like so many parts of a machine, ignoring the real functions of perceiving and acting. And he says people have also gone on to mechanize man himself. According to the behaviorist, he says man's own sensations and will are mere appearance, to be considered, if at all, only as disturbing static. But he, of course, argues for the opposite, and he says we who still hold that our sense organs serve our perceptions and our motor organs, our actions, see in animals as well, not only the mechanical structure, but also the operator who's built into their organs as we are into our bodies. In today's terms, you would call this embodied cognition. So the idea that the mind emerges from the body or is immanent in the body. So the quote goes on, we no longer regard animals as mere machines, but as subjects whose essential activity consists of perceiving and acting. We thus unlock the gates that lead to other realms, for all that the subject perceives becomes his perceptual world, and all that he does his affective world. And this, I think, should sound familiar from Juan Carlos' session last week. And this is the combination of perceptual and affective world is what von-uexkull calls the Umwelt. There's a diagram here. Where you have, not sure, can I point on this? Okay, where you have the subject and you have the object, and the subject is equipped with perceptual organs and affective organs, and kind of grasps the object and makes it its own object, in roughly the same sense that also Juan Carlos discussed in his session. I threw in a screenshot of one of his illustrations, and if you look at it, it's practically the same. The idea is that the organism, based on its sensorium and its affectorium, so its senses and effectors, and its need to perceive and act in the world, it takes element of the world surrounding it and turns them into its own objects. Just take the examples that I was talking about on the previous screen. The fly that might perceive the lamp as something to land on. So the fly or any animal imbues the world around it with its own meaning. Okay, here's just an example, the most famous one. The tick that von-uexkull, he actually studied ticks empirically. So he says, so when we look at what the tick does, we're not concerned with the chemical stimulus of butyric acid. Okay, I should maybe explain what the tick does. Is it sits normally on leaves, grass blades. It sits there and it can sit there for a very long time. And when it perceives butyric acid, which comes from the skin of mammals, it lets go, so it holds on to a leaf. When it perceives that butyric acid, it lets go, it lets itself fall, and if it's lucky, it lands on some mammal's skin. And when it perceives that particular stimulus, it starts moving around and moves towards the skin. And once it perceives the temperature of the skin, it starts drilling into the skin. So this is there are three relatively simple reflexes here which work in perfect succession for the tick. Okay, and von-uexkull says, okay, we're not so much all these things have mechanical, chemical properties and then mechanisms, but we're not so much concerned with those. But he says we're solely concerned with the fact that out of the hundreds of stimuli radiating from the qualities of the mammal's body, only 3 become the bearers of receptor cues for the tick. So the tick does not perceive the whole world, but it perceives the parts of the world that are relevant to it. So he says what we're dealing with is not an exchange of forces between 2 objects. So this is not a purely physical interaction, but the relations between a living subject and its object. So in this case, the tick and the mammal. Okay, and this, I mean, talking about ticks might seem not so super relevant because they're relatively simple creatures, and you might also perceive this as rather passive. I mean, the tick, it can sit for months on a leaf and wait for some mammal to pass by. So you might perceive this as a very passive case of a subject. It seems more like it maybe sounds more like an object, but the point here is, of course, that so you could interpret this as the organism as the organism being like a keyboard that the environment plays on, so where external stimuli release certain reflexes. So it's the environment that is active, whereas the organism is relatively passive. But Merleau-Ponty, for example, points out, he picked up this notion of Umwelt from von-uexkull, and he points out, as he says here, the organism cannot properly be compared to a keyboard on which the external stimuli would play, and in which their proper form would be delineated for the simple reason that the organism contributes to the constitution of that form, which he elaborates, saying it is the organism itself, according to the proper nature of its receptors, the thresholds of its nerve centers, and the movements of the organs, which chooses the stimuli in the physical world to which it will be sensitive. So he says the environment, or Umwelt, emerges from the world through the actualization or the being of the organism, granted that an organism can exist only if it succeeds in finding the world an adequate environment. Okay, so, and to get back to the keyboard metaphor, he says, this would be a keyboard which moves itself in such a way as to offer, and according to variable rhythms, such or such of its keys to the environment, to the in itself monotonous action of an external hammer. So he contradicts very much this notion of the organism as being passive and as being driven or triggered by the environment, but he points out that the organism is the active one in this, which makes use of the environment. Okay, one more aspect of von-uexkull that might be relevant, and then might be relevant to the discussion of autopoiesis later, is that von-uexkull points out that machines, so normal machines, and organisms are actually constructed or self-constructed in very different ways. He points out that every machine, and his example here is a pocket watch, he says every machine is always constructed centripetally. That means the individual parts of the watch, such as its hands, springs, wheels, and cogs, must always be produced first, so that they may be added to a common centerpiece. So, yeah. So his point is, if you build a machine, an artificial machine, you build the parts first, then you put them together. Whereas, of course, as he says here, in contrast, the construction of an animal, for example, a triton, we don't need to go into the details of what that is, always starts centrifugally from a single cell, which first develops into a gastrula and then into more and more new organ buds. In both cases, the transformation underlies a plan. The watch plan proceeds centripetally, and the triton plan centrifugally. So one grows inside out, whereas the other is constructed outside in, you could say. So, and he refers to this as two completely opposite principles governing the joining of the parts of the two objects. Okay, I think that's about everything I had to say on von-uexkull. Von-uexkull, yeah, it's not terribly famous, but he's actually very influential in the sense that he's influenced a lot of people a little bit. He's had an influence on Konrad Lorenz, for example, and ethology, so the study of animal behavior and how animals perceive their environments and so on. He's had an influence on Heidegger and on Hans Jonas, which I'll talk about next. His notion of the functional circle has been picked up in cybernetics. His notion of the Umwelt has also been picked up in embodied AI, although somewhat superficially. He's also very influential in semiotics, and what's now called biosemiotics is basically very much based on von-uexkull's research. And he's, of course, also very influential in radical constructivism. Okay, but that's just as a quick summary. Okay, then we come to Hans Jonas, which, as you probably recall from that little diagram I had with the blue, the pink, and the green paths, he was the one that Weber and Varela referred to as the main proponent of what they call the philosophical root, or the philosophical connection between Kant and intrinsic teleology. So, yeah, Hans Jonas was a philosopher of biology, and he coined the phrase "needful freedom," which is how he characterized what living systems do in interaction with the environment. They are free in the sense that they are autonomous and can basically do what they want. It's not that somebody else is controlling them, but they are, of course, also needful in the sense that they need the environment to survive in it. Okay, and here's a long quote from a paper that von-Foerster and I wrote about Hans Jonas and other theorists. So Jonas proposes that the process of ongoing metabolic self-construction has the necessary existential characteristics such that we can speak of the constitution of a meaningful perspective by that process and for that process. Quote goes on, most precisely, we can identify three aspects. First one is the ongoing metabolic self-generation of a distinct self, by which a living being separates itself from non-living matter. Second aspect is the precarious existence of the self, which is continually faced by material and energetic requirements. And thirdly, the establishment of a basic normativity in relation to whether events are good or bad for the continuation of this particular living being. So thus there is an inherent and insurmountable tension in the living mode of being, since an organism needs to separate itself from non-living matter in order to preserve its identity. But at the same time, it is, of course, also dependent on that matter as the background from which it can distinguish its identity. Those of you who are already familiar with the notion of autopoiesis, of course, see the similarities here, and the point that Weber and Varela were making in that paper from 2002 was that the scientific route, so the pink side of that diagram, and the green side of that diagram, so the philosophical route, that those were two different theoretical frameworks that were developed independently, but that are converging in a sense in this notion of intrinsic teleology that Kant, to some degree, initiated, but didn't quite complete, or didn't commit to 100%. Okay, I think we don't need to say so much more about Hans Jonas, but we can finally get to autopoiesis then, which was the title of this session. Okay, let's start let's start with a definition. And as I said, autopoiesis has been mentioned so many times in previous sessions everybody has at least a rough idea of what it is. And the people who have no idea at all will probably not understanding from just being exposed to it once. So, but let's start with the definition here. And then I take this particular way of introducing what autopoiesis is from a paper by Randall Beer. But I think the definition that he uses here is exactly from the original texts from Maturana and Varela. Okay, so the definition here goes: an autopoietic machine is a machine organized, defined as a unity, as a network of processes of production, by which we mean transformation and destruction, of component that produces the components which, firstly, through their interactions and transformations, continuously regenerate and realize the network of processes or relations that produce them, and secondly, constitute it, the machine, as a concrete unity in the space in which they, the components, exist by specifying the topological domain of its realization as such a network. Okay, that's not an easy definition to follow, as Bier also points out. He says, to put it mildly, this is not an easy definition to understand on first reading. So, and that's, of course, as I said, most of you probably have seen this definition before. Hopefully we all have at least a rough idea of what this means. Bier continues. He says, this definition is quite abstract. It makes use of somewhat idiosyncratic terminology, depends on a larger background of unfamiliar concepts, and exhibits an essential circularity that can be difficult to assimilate. And he points out there are also key differences in how subsequent authors have interpreted various aspects of this definition. And we'll come back to that. And even Maturana and Varela later diverged somewhat in their opinion of its scope and consequences. So there is a definition and there are different ways of formulating it. But it's at least difficult to understand, and there are also different interpretations of it. So let's look at an example then instead. And again, I'm following Bier's paper here. So the example is, of course, the paradigmatic example of an autopoietic system is the living cell. And a typical cell, consists of a large number of protein and water molecules. We don't need to go through all the details here, but one of the points is that it's bounded by a semi-permeable membrane formed from a bilayer of phospholipid molecules. So there's a membrane. And the material structure of such a cell is thus given by the physical details of these molecular components, their type, position, orientation, bonds, modes of vibration, and so on. However, and this is maybe the crucial point here, the cell itself can, of course, not be equated with this totality of material properties. And that is mainly because these properties are constantly changing. So over time, individual molecules move, rotate, enter, and leave the cell, while chemical bonds are continually being broken and reformed through reactions. And yet, as he points out here, despite this ongoing material change, the cell itself, as a delimited spatio-temporal organization of processes, persists. And this is, of course, the crucial phenomenon that the notion of autopoiesis was intended to capture. It's this persistence of identity in the face of material change. That is exactly what Maturana and Varela were trying to capture when they developed the notion of autopoiesis. Okay, and more specifically, their definition states two conditions that a network of processes must satisfy in order to be considered autopoietic. The first one is the so-called closure condition, which demands that the network of processes must produce the components whose interactions generate and maintain that very same network. And secondly, there's the boundary condition, which demands that the spatial boundary that distinguishes an autopoietic system from its background must itself be generated and maintained by the network of processes, and in turn must play a central role in enabling those same processes. Yeah. So I mean, as everybody knows, and as I said earlier, this is a complex notion, and yeah, you might not, if you're not familiar with it, it might take you more than one reading to understand this. But luckily, Beer also has a diagram, which makes it a little bit easier. So, and yeah, as it's also the text says there, this is an illustration of the central circularity of autopoiesis. So we have a bounded system in the middle of the diagram here, which generates a network of processes. That network of processes produces the components which determine that very same bounded system. And it's important to note here that although we have organizational closure, in the sense that this organization is circular, the system is of course both materially and interactionally open to its environment. So it's both a closed system and an open system at the same time. Okay, I'll just quickly say something about computational models. Again, the diagram on the left comes from Juan Carlos' session. If you attended that, you remember that he mentioned that, in fact, one of the original papers on autopoiesis already contained a computational model. And yeah, I'm not going to go into the details here, but that model, so basically 50 years old, was of course one of the very first models of what we now call artificial life. Since then, there've been a number of other models. A number of people have been trying to in particular, Barry McMullen in Dublin, I think, has been trying to implement the original model and found some flaws and changed some things and so on. And he's also been, I think he wrote one paper in '97 together with Francisco Varela on rediscovering the original model. And since then, he's basically writing a new paper every 10 years or so about this. So there's one called 30 Years of Computational Autopoiesis, and another one called 40 Years of Computational Autopoiesis. And those papers summarize relatively well what's happening and how people are building models of this and what the developments are. And there's of course also I mentioned Randall Beer on the previous slides. He's also done some work on providing computational models of both how autopoiesis as such as a phenomenon, but also how it might have developed or evolved. Okay, I'm not gonna. This is all very technical work, and I'm personally only understand maybe 20% of this, so I'm not gonna try to go into much more detail here. But I'll get back to my little diagram, and what I said in the last I don't know, half hour or so, mainly was motivated by this this connection between Kant and the notion of intrinsic teleology. Kant was kind of the one who suggested it, that there's something special about organisms and that it is this immanent or intrinsic teleology, the fact the fact that organisms and carry their own purpose and carry their own goals. Then I talked about the last thing I just talked about was the autopoiesis perspective on how we can get to that. Also the you could say the scientific perspective. And I also talked a little bit less about the philosophical route to intrinsic teleology, and in the middle there, I also talked about von-Uexkull's theoretical biology. And what's one thing to note is, of course, that the way that Weber and Varela presented in the paper from 2002 and the way I presented it. So Weber and Varela only talked about the you could say the pink root and the green root, whereas I added the blue root here to make it more complete. But what their presentation and then my presentation have in common is that they kind of assume that everybody's converging towards this notion of intrinsic teleology, which is, of course, those of you who are familiar with the discussion are very aware of this, is of course not an unproblematic concept. It's not only unproblematic. It's not only problematic in the sense that there are different views of this in the scientific community, but there are also different views on this within the community that we constitute, or within the autopoiesis school. So, and this has been pointed out, among others, in a paper by Evan Thompson from 2004. And for those who are not familiar, this is of course the same Thompson as in Varela, Thompson, and Roche, the Embodied Mind book from '91. And he pointed out an interesting tension here. And he asked, how are we to understand this suggestion of teleology in relation to the theory of autopoiesis, which in its original formulation was explicitly mechanistic and anti-teleological. So, for example, Maturana and Varela explicitly identified, in the early papers, explicitly identified living systems with machines and denied that living systems are teleological. So, for example, they explicitly said living systems as physical autopoietic machines are purposeless systems, which is kind of the opposite of teleological. And then Evan Thompson further elaborates that Francisco Varela in his articles up to the early 90s very much continued to resist the idea that autopoiesis involves anything teleological. But in one of his last essays, which is this paper with Andreas Weber, he changed his mind. That's at least Evan Thompson's interpretation. And he says this essay written with Andreas Weber concerns autopoiesis and the problem of teleology and the organism from Kant's critique of judgment. And there, in this paper, which I've talked about now, Francisco argues that teleology arises from autopoiesis and is none other than the organism's sense-making. And he points out, and again, this comes from a very personal paper. I mean, that paper is based on a talk that he gave as a tribute to Francisco Varela. So this is can be read as a very personal remark on the work of somebody that he's actually collaborated with closely himself. And so Evan Thompson continues here saying, yet strangely, he doesn't even mention, let alone discuss, the change from his earlier to later view, nor the reasons for the change. Nor does he comment on his earlier acceptance of the life as machine notion, which is another striking omission considering that one of Kant's main points was that organisms are natural purposes by virtue of being self-organizing and must be judged to be fundamentally different from machines. Okay, and I think that's of course one of the points that might be interesting to discuss here. This tension that Evan Thompson points out, and I mean he attributes this. He focuses on Francisco Varela's role in all this, but there's of course, you could of course point out, one obvious thing to point out is that that quote with Maturana had two authors, and that paper with Andreas Weber, they both have two authors. So it's not entirely clear here whose opinion is formulated here, or whose opinion is expressed here. Anyway, that might be an interesting thing to discuss after I'm done, which will be done in 5 minutes or so. Then there are, of course, a number of other interesting tensions which you probably have picked up on already. So there's, for example, the question, what kind of system can actually be autopoietic? On the one hand, if we look at the definitions that are around, they seem to be very exact, and that's the point of a definition. And they are very scientific, and they try to pin down exactly what it is, what it means to be autopoietic. But on the other hand, there seem to be different types of systems or different levels that are referred to as autopoietic. So strictly speaking, that's one interpretation. It's maybe only individual cells that are autopoietic systems. But you can also find, for example, in the Tree of Knowledge book by Maturana and Varela, you can also find the term second-order autopoietic systems, which is applied to metacellulars, so organisms. And you can also find the notion of third-order unities, which is like beehives or ant colonies. So there's certainly a broad range of systems that are referred to as autopoietic. And related to the above, and this was also mentioned to some degree in Juan Carlos' session last week, in addition to what I just mentioned, there's of course also the work by others, in particular Luhmann, who have applied the notion of autopoiesis to social systems theory, based on the idea of communications as the elements of autopoietic social systems, capable of reproducing themselves because they are communication systems. So this, of course, is another tension that I thought might be worth bringing up here, that on the one hand, we seem to have a very exact scientific definition of what autopoiesis is, and according to that, maybe it's only individual cells. But on the other hand, people seem to be applying this notion of autopoiesis a little bit all over the place. And it's also Maturana and Varela who are doing that themselves to some degree. Okay, so I think this book was also mentioned last week by Juan Carlos. There's, for example, people are applying to autopoiesis to in the domain of architecture. People are talking about autopoietic organization theory. People are talking about law as an autopoietic system, and autopoietic law. So there's autopoiesis has really gone all the way from individual cells to complex social and cultural systems. So that might also be something to discuss. And then another point that I just want to make very quickly, or it's not so much a point, but rather a question. And the question is, how exactly do autopoiesis and enaction relate to other approaches to embodied cognition, in particular ones that might be referred to as representationalist in some sense. The diagram there on the right just comes from some recent book chapter of mine, where I try to distinguish different views of cognition, and okay, roughly speaking, at the first level we can distinguish between the view of cognition as a computational phenomenon and the view of cognition as a biological phenomenon. Okay, and certainly, most people here probably oppose the idea of cognition as a computational phenomenon and endorse the idea of cognition as a biological phenomenon. But within that space, so in the lower half of that diagram, there are still two different kinds of approaches, and one is the one where autopoiesis, enaction, and ecological psychology fall in, and that's what's here called non-representational embodied cognition. But there are also a bunch of theories or theoretical frameworks which fit into what here in this diagram is called representational embodied cognition. And there, for example, I would put Mark Pickett's interactivism theory, And his notion of cognitive systems as recursively self-maintaining, far from thermodynamic equilibrium systems. I'm not going to go into any of the details here, but those of you who are familiar with this will, of course, understand that this notion of living systems of cognitive systems and the living systems as recursively self-maintaining is, of course, rather close. It's very close to the notion of autopoiesis, but Picard interprets this rather differently, and in particular, he has a representationalist interpretation of what it is that living systems do in interaction with the environment, and he also has a well elaborated theory of how normativity comes about in this kind of system. And if you follow the literature, you can see that there's unfortunately relatively little interaction between that type of theory of cognition as a biological phenomenon and so there's relatively little interaction between the representational and the non-representational category that you find in the lower half of the diagram here. And then somewhere in that corner, you would also find, for example, the work of Antonio Damasio, who has for a very long time, since I think the late 80s or so, criticized what he calls the prevalent absence of a notion of organism in the sciences of mind and brain, which is very much in line with autopoiesis and enaction. And he's argued for a view of mind as emergent from nested levels of homeostatic regulation of bodily activity. And I just threw in that little tiny diagram there. According to him, different levels of mind and cognition really are organized in some kind of tree-like organization where metabolic regulation is at the bottom and is at the foot of everything, underlying everything, essentially. And again, this kind of theory is closely related, I would claim, to ideas of autopoiesis and enaction, but there's still relatively little interaction in the literature about this. Okay, I think that's basically, I think I've reached my last slide here. So in sum, on the last slide, I just want to throw up some questions. And by the way, I don't necessarily expect that these questions will be answered today. I mean, obviously, there's another session on autopoiesis in, I don't know, a week or two with another speaker. And obviously, this semester is going to go on, and it's just 1 out of 4 semesters. So I'm not expecting these questions to be answered, neither these questions on this slide, nor the questions on the previous slides, but I'm just throwing those out here. So firstly, this notion of intrinsic or immanent teleology played a central role in my presentation. And the question simply is, how are we to interpret this? Are autopoietic systems purposeless, as Maturana and Varela said back in 1980? Or are they not purposeless? And in fact, intrinsically teleological, as Weber and Varela said in 2002. Those seem to contradict each other. Or is it the case that this is just a superficial, a seeming contradiction? Can living systems actually be both purposeless in the sense that Maturana and Varela formulated it in 1980, and purposeful or teleological in the sense that Weber and Varela formulated it 20 years later? And there's also, the question that I called the more the merrier. So exactly how many notions or levels of autopoiesis do we actually need or want? I mean, everybody who's attending this core Enaction program is of course obviously has a lively interest in autopoiesis, but there's always this tension between autopoiesis in the narrow sense and autopoiesis in the wider sense and autopoiesis in the very wide sense. So that might also be one question that might be worth addressing. As I said, not necessarily now, but maybe maybe after the next session on autopoiesis or at some other point. Okay, and I think I've talked for pretty much exactly an hour. So I think I'll stop here. And are we taking a break? I think we're taking a break, right?
Yes, thank you very much for this incredible talk. Thank you so much. And yes, as usual, we are taking a break. I think a 10 minutes break could work. So we can see each other here in 10 minutes and at 7:19, 7:20, more or less. And thank you again.
Mm-hmm.
And so then we will start the session of question and answer session. Thank you very much.
Okay.
So see you in a bit. You're back. Welcome back. Thank you again, Tom. So we can start our Q&A session. Last time we had a very intense discussion, so I hope we can repropose this evening. We have more than half an hour, so I really hope that we can discuss on the basis of many questions, basic question, very more articulated questions, but please feel free to make questions. And please, if you want to make questions, put something in the chat so that I can see, because I have some problems of visualization, so I could miss some of the question or the hands. So I think Jose raised his hand. So
yes.
Thank you very much, Jose.
Thank you very much to you, and thank you very much, Tom. That was really amazing. I have lots of questions, so I'll try to articulate something that resembles one question. So it's about this issue of teleology in biological systems. So, and in particular about the role of the observer, right? Because one thing is to say that a biological system, an organism, is intrinsically teleological in the sense that it is the cause and cause and result of itself. And a different thing is to say, well, this particular system wants to move in a certain direction because it wants to survive, or has some the purposes or the purposes that I cannot see as an external observer are intrinsic to the system. It's a different thing to say those two, right? And I would like to connect that with this idea of representation, because when we say that the system is creating representations in their own world, right? Because every animal, every living being creates its own world and creates its own objects, and we don't have access to those objects, right? I mean, we live in a different world from them, so it would be a mistake to ascribe the objects that I am experiencing to them in a way, right? So how can it be useful for me as a researcher, let's say a neuroscientist, to try to look for representations in that organism? So, I mean, you don't have to answer the question specifically. I mean, feel free to comment, because I know I'm just mixing up a lot of things here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question 100%, but what you're saying resonates with some of my own questions. So I would be happy if somebody else could answer parts of your questions that I can't address. But you are, of course, completely right about you said something about that it would be wrong of us to ascribe our own interpretation to some animal, for example. And I maybe should have been clear on that point also when I talked about von-uexkull, and you know, he had these illustrations of how a fly or a dog might perceive the same room that a person perceives. And those are, of course, yeah, those still look very similar to each other, right? And I mean, that's the examples that I gave, that whatever, the fly might be attracted to the light and might sit on the lamp, which might not be an affordance for a dog, and so on. I mean, those are, of course, I'm only giving my interpretations of very simple examples here. And I think von-Uexkull himself was, of course, very aware of this, that he wasn't trying to say, this is how the fly envisions the same room as the person, but he was just sketching some rough idea of what things might look like, so that it becomes understandable to people. But it's of course still for the purpose of communicating to people how the world might look different to, let's say, a fly, a person, and a dog. So it's still very human-centered, and it doesn't really illustrate how the fly might see the world or how the dog might see the world, because, yeah, I mean, I don't know much about fly or dog vision, but I don't know, they presumably perceive different colors than we do, for example. So this is just some very rough approximation of the general idea of what the Umwelt is, and how it might differ between different organisms. Okay, that was my answer to that part of your question. Then I'm not sure I understood the very first part of your question. You said certainly it's different to attribute. Yeah, maybe you could just repeat it, because it sounded to me the two options sounded the same. And you said, oh, certainly we can agree that these two are different.
Yeah, I put it in a very unclear way. Sorry, it's a bit late. So what I was saying is that so one thing is to say that the organism is intrinsically teleological, right? So it produces itself and therefore its own purpose, right? It doesn't have. It's not an extrinsic purpose, but an intrinsic purpose. But what is not clear to me is when we extend this teleology beyond the organism and we start saying, well, the organism is trying to achieve something, is trying to, let's say, minimize the free energy or whatever, is trying to survive, and these are things that are extrinsic to the organism, that they come from the observer in a way, from the external observer. So this is a bit confusing to me, these two things, because usually we don't make this distinction, and I have the feeling that people tend to extend this discussion beyond the intrinsic teleology of the organism and try to extend it to other things, and then things get confused. But it might be my own confusion. I don't know. Maybe you can comment a bit on that.
I think I agree. And if I can reformulate the question, I think your point is that there's a difference between saying that the striving for survival is this intrinsic purpose of an organism, and there's a difference between that and saying that this particular organism wants to survive or something like that, because the particular organism that we're talking about might not be thinking about survival at all. It might not be thinking. It's just that the striving for survival is immanent in its activity, in the sense that that's what it does. And I always use in many of my talks, I use the example of eels traveling. Many of you have probably heard this story before. European eels travel to the Sargasso Sea to mate. So the Sargasso Sea is outside Bermuda, something like that. So it's on the other side of the Atlantic. So they travel there, you could say, for that purpose, but that is of course just our human level description, because they, depending on how you want to frame this, you could say that that's the purpose for which they travel there. But on the other hand, you could say they just happen to travel there. And they certainly, in the case of eels, I think most of us would agree, they certainly have no internal representation of what it is that they're doing. They don't have any map in the human sense of where they're going. So this or this explanation or justification of why they're traveling from Europe all across the Atlantic to the Sargasso Sea is you could say it's just a construction. It's some kind of storytelling, and this example, of course, illustrates very well this tension that was also pointed out in the presentation, or was pointed out in Evan Thompson's paper, and then I brought that up here. This tension between, on the one hand, of course, autopoietic systems are purposeless systems. On the other hand, they are, of course, not. Of course, I mean, the eels do travel across the Atlantic for a purpose, but on the other hand, they are purposeless. So personally, I mean, that's why I try to phrase the question rather openly at the end. So, are they purposeless, or are they not purposeless, or are they maybe both? Because personally, I think it might very well be the case that they're both, although that sounds like a contradiction. But they, of course, both in the sense, again, this takes me back to one of the earliest slides about Kant, where he was talking about the phenomena and the noumena. So the world as it appears to us, and the world how it is, and which we don't have direct access to. And yeah, to me, one thing that always has struck me as odd about some discussions about autopoiesis, or researchers interested in autopoiesis, is this commitment to because autopoiesis, I mean, is a statement about organisms as they really are, right? I mean, it's a statement about noumena. Whereas if you're a strict Kantian in that sense, and the distinction between phenomena and noumena, you really, I don't know, you shouldn't even try to make strong statements about how living systems really are. You can only, in Kant's sense, make strong statements about your perception of those systems as autopoietic systems, as being teleological in our interpretation. But if you make that distinction, then you're of course exactly stuck in that what Weber and Varela called an unstable middle position, because you're acknowledging that living organisms are teleological. I mean, they do have purposes. Those eels do travel across the Atlantic for a reason and for a purpose, if you want to formulate it that. But on the other hand, you could say that they're not. So there's really, and the distinction is, if we view those organisms as phenomena, they certainly are teleological. If we view them as noumena, in the Kantian sense, we shouldn't be making any statements about them, because we don't know for sure. We can only judge based on our phenomena. And this little distinction and mix up, you can also find very much in von-uexkull, which I talked in some detail about, because on the one hand, he's talking about emphasizing how animals are subjects, and then he emphasizes that very much. But on the other hand, he is, of course, he is treating them as objects. He's studying them. He's not asking the tick or interviewing it or treating it as a subject. In his research, he's of course treating it as an object also. So that's, I think there's a bit of a tension there, and I won't be able to resolve it here. So I'd be happy to hear other people's opinion, because so that tension that I try to bring up there is not just the tension between what Maturana and Varela said in 1980 and what Weber and Varela said in 2002, but it's a tension in how we all relate to what we're discussing, and how we view the world from different perspectives, and in particular, if we use the Kantian terms in terms of phenomena and noumena. I mean, simply is something I think we can't get around the tension. I mean, we can decide for one way, one interpretation or the other, but we cannot escape the fact that some of us are going to choose one representation, one interpretation, and others are going to choose another, and that in fact we ourselves might very well be taking different interpretations at different points in time. Sorry, that was a very vague answer, but don't think I can answer it much better right now.
Thank you very much. I don't know if there is someone that wants to go on and with this discussion, or we can start with a new question. Rojo is following this discussion?
Kind of, yes. Very simple, actually. Well, maybe it's very deep, but I don't know. I was just wondering for everyone, or Tom, well, hi everyone first. I was wondering about what do we mean as purpose, because apparently that's the difference, no? If they're purpose or they're purposeless, but do we all have the same understanding of what purpose is or not, or it's a perception again? Because that might be an important topic to address, I don't know, or at least for me to have a better understanding.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And usually I'm the one who brings up that kind of question. So I won't be able to answer it. I mean, the easy question is, we most definitely don't have one notion or one definition of what purpose is. I mean, we're like 25 or so in this meeting right now. And I would assume we have at least 5, 6 different notions of what a purpose is. So I'm not gonna try to explain my notion or the particular researchers that I've talked about in much more detail, but it's I mean, the fact that we don't have a joint notion of what a purpose is already is part of this tension that we're talking about, and it's part of what I said. Maybe the simple way out is to say that they're both purposeful and purposeless, because it depends on your notion of purpose.
Thank you very much. We had Wolfgang with questions about this. Maybe Wolfgang, you can summarize your question. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. I think it's related to these points about the tension, and I was wondering if it's actually a tension, or is there like a complementarity on different levels of investigation. If autopoiesis, if I would see that with my limited understanding, of course, but as a description of, or maybe a prescription, but anyway, for systems in the way that it is described. As such, just like physics, if you take another level of description, it describes something, but it doesn't need teleology as part of it. But if it doesn't claim to describe everything about the world, there is still, space for a different level of description. So I was wondering if autopoiesis would describe by itself something that. Sorry, I'm making my own question now very complicated. It felt much simpler before. But if you'd say, okay, if you go to another level and you say an autopoietic system described by these principles, then has the capability to do sense making, to find, to enact a purpose, but that is on a complementary or on another level of description, so they can actually go very well together. But it's not that one level tries to say it describes everything. So, but I don't know about the historical way how this argument developed. I'm just wondering if there's actually even really a contradiction, and maybe with the example of physics instead of autopoiesis, for instance, or chemistry, let's say, one can see that they can harmonize, but I don't know. What are your thoughts on this? I hope you understand my question.
Yeah, I think I understand the question. And personally, my hunch is that they are complementary in the sense that they are different perspectives. And your question actually reminds me of a different paper that I just wrote for a special issue that Luis is editing, actually, where I'm trying to make a very similar point, although it's about interpretation of how people interpret robot behavior, or let's say the behavior of automated vehicles. Because if you interact with that kind of system, let's say an automated vehicle, this is my standard example, an automated vehicle that you meet at a crosswalk. So you want to cross the road, there's an automated vehicle coming, and you have to interpret that vehicle's behavior. And on the one hand, you can, of course, say, well, this is just an automated vehicle, it's some kind of robot. It certainly doesn't understand my human goals and worries and so on. So you can interpret it as a purely technical system and then try to interpret it in terms of what you know about the system, what sensors it has, and so on. But you're, of course, not going to get very far with that, because that you probably don't know enough about that particular car or that particular robot that you're interacting with to make that kind of prediction of what its behavior is. I mean, even the people who programmed it probably can't predict its behavior. So you will instead, you will ask yourself, most probably, this is what Daniel calls the attentional intent, you will ask yourself questions like, has that car seen me? Does it understand I want to cross the road? Does it intend to slow down to let me cross the road? So you're going to ask yourself these folk psychological questions, and that kind of requires you you're answering, you're predicting the behavior of the vehicle in your own human-like terms, although you know very well that it's not a human-like system. And that requires you to have this, on the one hand, a suspension of disbelief. So you know that the car doesn't reason like a person, but in order to understand the car, you need, because your understanding is in human terms, you need to interpret it in human terms. So that's the suspension of disbelief. You know it doesn't have human beliefs, but you need to treat it like that. And on the other hand, there's this suspension of belief, because you might come to some conclusion about what the car will do in your own human-like terms, but then you need to be able to keep in mind that, well, this is just my own interpretation of it in human-like terms, which is not the terms in which this car deals with the world. And I think, okay, sorry for the extended example here, but I think it's similar in what you were hinting at the end of the question in the chat about the complementarity of different descriptions, because it's not in my example of the automated car, it's not one or the other, but you need both. If you just thought of the car as a technical system, you would never be able, or 90% of us would never be able to predict what it will do. If you just treated it in your own folk psychological human-like terms, you would probably not be happy either, because you would be missing the point that, yeah, you're just anthropomorphizing, and that might be a good description of the behavior, but it might not. So you should really keep those two perspectives in mind. And it's similar, maybe what we were saying earlier about purposes and autopoietic systems being purposeless or purposeful, because maybe in that sense they can be both, and those are just different perspectives on the same thing. But that, I mean, you can of course easily imagine. I mean, that would probably be my own opinion or my own conclusion. But you can of course, this is roughly the same thing that Kant would have said 200 years ago, and that is a position that not everybody was happy with. I mean, they called it an unstable middle position for a reason, because it is. What exactly am I saying when I'm saying that something is purposeless and purposeful at the same time, or that an automated vehicle can be interpreted as a person but cannot be interpreted as a person? Obviously this is a what they call an unstable middle position. I'm just personally I think we can perfectly live with that kind of middle position, but different positions might be different, might be desirable for different purposes. So as scientists, of course, we would like to have one way of dealing with it. But as the pedestrian standing at the crosswalk interacting with that automated car, that's a different thing. I'm not acting as the scientist in that particular case, but I'm acting as the one who has to interact with that particular system.
Thank you very much. I apologize with Nicole. I would simply go to the question of Chris because follows this trend and then go to Nicole. So Chris?
Hello. I take it that you're the expert on Hans Jonas here.
Well, I wouldn't claim that, but other people know more about him. But yeah, I've written papers about him. Let's say it like that.
Okay, well, it's much more than I know. But basically, at the end of your slides, sort of where you end up is kind of where I've been stuck for the last 10 years. But I would, in regards to purpose and evolutionary purpose, and I think, you know, I have Jonas's work, The Phenomenon of Life, you know, and he talks about in causality and perception. And I think this is related to the notion because whenever you talk about teleology, in this sense, you're talking about, you know, you have to be bound up with causation and emergence. And in particular with evolution, you have to be bound up with this idea of what do we mean by downward causation? And in the spirit of Donald Campbell, right, with hierarchical systems, and what we mean when we say that an organism is exhibiting, you know, downward causation in its behavior, you know, it seems like there has to be a unifying teleology for that reason. And I know that, you know, Thompson says that autopoiesis is basically it's a necessary condition for evolution and natural selection to proceed, right, in that sense. But then there is a teleology then in natural selection or in the natural world, right, that the organism is in and is exploring and is developing in. And could you speak to what Jonas might say for, because he goes pretty far, I think, in terms of purpose. I mean, he goes, all the way to God, if I'm not mistaken, and an argument for the necessity of having, you know, a theological view on this subject. So, and I'm not going that far, but.
Yeah, I don't think I can add very much. I mean, the question was already quite content rich, so I don't think I can answer the question too much to much of a degree. I mean, I've read Jonas and but I wouldn't be able to answer the question much more than you already did in formulating the question. The question of causation is a very tricky one. I think causation is in general a topic that is very difficult for us to even discuss in human language. It's certainly problematic, and in particular, downward causation is yeah, maybe the most extreme case of that. So yeah. No, I don't think I have a better answer than that. But I mean, we're 25 people. Maybe somebody else could address that question.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't see people following this, so I would go back to Nicole. Maybe Nicole, you want to intervene and to give. She was moving the discussion towards the second of the issues you were putting at the center of the discussion at the end of your talk, Tom. Call Nicole.
Hi, thank you for this. Thanks to everyone. I guess I wasn't really raising a question, just expressing gratitude at the ideas, the different ideas able to exist together and just let it getting big with things. And maybe the natural world that these organisms are in is actually an autopoietic system itself, and what that could mean just by way of thinking about things in more artistic ways. I'm an artist, not a scientist, so I don't have the pressure to come up with answers. I get to live in that middle ground. being able to just think in multiple ways without feeling. Sometimes I might make myself a bit crazy trying to philosophically understand existence, but yeah, I was just appreciating the notion of that these things might be part of the undescribable nature of the noumenon.
Well, what you're saying sounds a bit like, I mean, as you said yourself, it wasn't really a question, it was just a comment, but what you're saying sounds a bit like Gaia theory, which would be the claim that we can think of ecosystems or the whole planet, in fact, as maybe one autopoietic system. So so that adds another level to the ones that I mentioned. It's just I just thought it. I mean, I don't have any answer to this myself. It always struck me as slightly weird, although not necessarily worrying. But the fact that the classical case, and strictly speaking, maybe the only case, which is strictly speaking autopoietic, is the individual cell. Yet people obviously apply the concept of autopoiesis to organisms, and to much larger systems than that, all the way up to in the case of Gaia theory, essentially the whole planet. So it's just an interesting fact, or an interesting observation, that that we have concepts like that. And I mean, I'm certainly not the only one talking about autopoiesis, so I certainly would be interested in hearing others speak about this. For example, Luisa, I mean, obviously you've thought about autopoiesis a lot, so what is it for you?
I was going to ask you something about the generalization of the notion of autopoiesis proposed by Francisco Varela in Principles of Biological Autonomy, that, for example, you are mentioning the article with von-Foerster that you mentioned before. And if this could be a good way of applying the take-home messages from autopoiesis to give interpretations that are anti-computationalist, interpretation in different areas that are exceed the level of the individual cell. In my view, I tend to see things like this. I think that this is a very fruitful way, this generalization that was offered through the theory of autonomous system in Principles of Biological Autonomy, to cover other domains and to at least draw the general lines of interpretation that are alternative to the computationalist interpretation of interactions in different domains that are not necessarily the one of the individual cell. And I wanted to ask you what you think of this tool.
Yeah, I think I agree to that 100%, probably. I mean, maybe in a sense, autopoiesis is although it's historically speaking the central or the original concept, maybe it's not necessarily, I mean from a biological perspective, maybe it's the central concept, but from my own perspective, which is cognitive science, and as I just illustrated with the examples that I talked about, is in human-robot interaction, how people interact with technology. Maybe the question of autopoiesis isn't so central there, because we don't. I mean, it's obvious that a robot is not autopoietic, and it's obvious that people are. So it's more about the understanding of the differences between the different types of systems and what they imply, and then understanding the differences in autonomy, which of course you recognize from earlier discussions and that particular paper which I just submitted to you. So that's an interesting, that's the more interesting question, that to see that there are different levels or different forms of autonomy, and that we need to be able to think of artificial autonomous systems as autonomous in certain senses and not autonomous in other senses. And the same, of course, applies to other types of autonomous systems that come from that relate to the work that you mentioned. Yeah, and and to think of autonomy as a complex, multifaceted concept that can apply to different types of systems, and that there's usefulness in having that general notion of autonomy without making it too what would you say, too broad a concept. So it can be a useful concept while keeping in mind, so to say something about autonomous system in general, while keeping in mind that two different types of autonomous systems are not necessarily autonomous in the same sense.
Yeah, so maybe we could agree in a Gaia scene as an autonomous, an ecology of autonomous system in which there are many different kinds of autonomy.
Mm.
Maybe this could be a way in which we meet also with.
Mm.
And I see another question from Noga Vyat.
Yes, thank you. Well, before my question, I would really like to thank you, actually, Tom. I think you've said that you're gonna just repeat what everyone else said, but for me, your talk was really, really helpful in making sense and organizing everything. So thanks. And my question actually relates to what you've just discussed, but maybe you've answered it and I missed it. So when you talked about the different levels of systems, you mentioned some examples, all of which are of living systems, and also Kant the distinction was between organisms and objects. Now, I read a lot about dynamical systems now, and it's not the same, but some concepts, some core concepts sound similar, like the self-organization and the circularity between the system and the components. So I wanted to ask about this in two ways. One is about the ideas. What part is really distinct to or unique to living systems rather than systems in general? Mm. And the second question is maybe for the organizers and not only for you, but are we going to have some talk or some discussion of the relation to dynamical systems in that area? I don't know if it's part of the official genealogy, but I think I've read Thompson and Varela refer to dynamical systems explicitly and suggesting to adopt some methods from there. So I was wondering about that.
Thank you. No, the first part and then is for Tom.
Yeah. Okay, I think the question was, are living systems? I mean, I think the straightforward answer would be, maybe misunderstanding the question. The straightforward answer would be, well, of course, living systems are a particular type of dynamical systems. And if I understood it right, your question was, yeah, what is the particular difference? And I would say it's what I talked about today. This idea of an intrinsic teleology, the idea of what Kant refers to as natural purposes, so that systems, that have their own built-in purpose, which are different from other dynamical systems. Let's say whatever weather phenomena or something like that, which can be dynamical systems. I mean, many systems are dynamical systems, but most of them are not, or many of them are not self-maintaining or purposeful in the particular sense that I talked about today. I don't know. It seems like an obvious answer to me, so maybe it isn't an answer. Maybe I misunderstood the question. Yeah, and maybe the second question to the organizers. What does Luisa say?
Yes, and about this, I said we didn't plan specifically a session on this, but we will try to introduce the topic if we can in the last meetings of this genealogy, and if we cannot, surely we will find a way to address this in the future seasons of Core Enaction. So I will let you know more specifically. Okay, thank you very much. I see that there are other questions from Rojo, another question, and then from Wolfgang. Rojo, I don't know if I pronounce it well, your name, I'm sorry.
Don't worry, it's Rocio. Rojo actually it's red.
Sorry.
So,
Thank
but
Thank you very much.
Don't worry. I just, as I wrote it down, it was just sharing because I don't know, it might sound philosophically incorrect, or all these terms that have categories and definitions. So I come from a very different background. So this is the question. I was wondering about if it's possible to consider the sense of self as an autopoietic system, and if we consider that, this came to mind after Chris asked. Well, he developed some things that I could kind of understand about purpose, and he ended up mentioning something about teleology and God or something like that. So the connection that I did, wondering if it's possible to think of the sense of self and as an autopoietic system, again, the sense of purpose, and this idea, maybe, I don't know, it's stretching it too much, because maybe these words, I understanding them as something, and in this system they mean another. But when we talk about sense of purpose and the way, I don't know, I'm thinking about Sartre or people that if you end up being like too categorical, you can end up with no sense of purpose. And when I think about Buddhism, or I don't know, the way the sense of self, the self can understand purpose. So I was going through this loop in my mind, basically, and I wrote it because I don't have actually a question. I was just sharing thoughts, and I don't know, how does this sound to you, basically?
I just have a quick comment on that, since you mentioned God and Chris also did earlier. I personally have no strong opinion on that. I always try to stay away from that topic. But it might be interesting to know that Jakob von-Uexkull, he was actually deeply religious. So he saw nature as some kind of divine creation. And when he talks about plants and animals, or every organism having a building plan, some sense. So he, it's not always clear how much he believes in it himself, because I mean, he lived 1864 to 1944, so the world was very different then. But he certainly he speaks about these things as if he actually believes in God, and that it is God that provides these plants to nature. Okay, I see Chris raising his hand. Right?
Yeah. So if I can unite sort of this idea of a sense of self and self-organization, and the feeling of self, there's like the neurodynamical model, right, where everything's giving rise to the sense of self, the perception of the moment, the flow of the moment. I think it was Walter Freeman or something like that. But with regards to God and purposeness, so when I was stuck, I had this notion that like maybe the conceptual realm, the conceptual world organizes itself around a purpose, right? And maybe one of those purposes, just because it's in the air, it's things that maybe it's something that we all tend to concern ourselves with, is the notion of salvation or soteriological, and maybe something like that, a concept actually, as an example, will organize the rest of your thinking without you really knowing it. and that the idea of God then becomes like this anchor, or this you know, like an attractor for all the other concepts. So I was thinking maybe you could extend sort of the cognition to the conceptual realm, and then the idea of, you know, autonomy or organization in that way, where, you know, concepts themselves are, you know, pulled somewhere, right? That was my idea.
I see it's past 8 o'clock.
Yes.
How long do we go on, Luisa?
Yes, no, I wanted to know simply if Wolfgang wanted to add something, and then simply announce the next session and close this session.
I would only have more questions, but it's like the wish to understand better the difference between autonomous systems and autopoietic systems, with the example of the sense of self, for instance, or maybe starting with something smaller. But it's more like, yeah, it's not a question for now, I think.
Yes, but thank you very much, because we will go back to this. Maybe we can collect this question also for the last of the session, so we can discuss deeply this super interesting topics that are emerging. Also from Jose, I think.
Yes, very briefly, it's just a comment related to Rocio's question about the relationship between the autopoietic organization and the creation of self. This is something we haven't discussed much, and I think is super relevant. And I mean, it's important to mention that autopoiesis means production of self, but also in a way, at the same time, self-production. So self-production and implies production of self. But I guess we will discuss this with Evan more deeply. I don't know if
Thank you very much. Please, as Amy suggested in the chat, put this question in the Dropbox so that we can organize a structured discussion about this. Again, Tom, thank you so much for your super talk and for your generosity in discussing with us this evening. Thanks to everybody for their very intense and super interesting discussion. So we will have a next session on the 9th of November, the second session about autopoiesis. So we will have the pleasure of meeting again Juan Carlos for this, and having also, as we promised, a part of his lecture dedicated to the co-creation of an object based on his view of structural coupling. Then I don't know, and then of course we will have Ivan Thompson with the last of the session with lectures about autonomous systems. So thank you again very much for your participation. Thank you again, Tom, and see you on the 9th of November. Thank you again.